Hey guys, so I recently got a chance to use the R5 for a little while and do a few different shoots with that. And I'm currently actually an EOS R owner, and I've been looking into maybe getting the R6. And the thing about the R5 and the R6 is in performance, they're actually very, very similar, and they just have a few differences in kind of some headline features that they have. So obviously there's a big difference in resolution there, and there's also some pretty big differences in day-to-day usage between these cameras. So today I'm going to talk about why I think the R5 is actually such a great camera, but then also some of the cons that you might have shooting with it, and maybe who this camera might be right for. So just a quick overview of the specs. This is the 45 megapixel full frame sensor, and we have dual pixel autofocus version 2, which covers 100% of the sensor and is really great. In stills mode, we can shoot up to 12 frames per second with the mechanical shutter and up to 20 frames per second with the electronic shutter. We also have face and eye detect autofocus in both photo and video. And while we're talking about video, this camera can shoot up to 8K RAW in 12-bit internally, and also in 10-bit 422 in C-Log. We can also shoot in 4K 10-bit 422 in C-Log up to 120 frames per second. We keep full dual pixel version 2 autofocus in all of those modes, and the camera also has a CF Express Type B card and one UHS 2 SD card slot. So when it comes to ergonomics here, it's really nice to shoot with. It's basically the same ergonomically as the R and the R6, and these cameras are definitely my favorite ergonomics for mirrorless cameras. And you can also get a battery grip for the R5, which I actually ended up shooting with for most of the time that I was shooting with this camera. And while we're talking about batteries, this camera uses the LPE6NH, which is the newest form of the LP6 battery that Canon's been using on their cameras really since the 5D Mark II, like for more than a decade. The EVF in this camera is great. It's 0.5 inch, 5.7 megapixel OLED EVF, and the quality in the EVF is awesome. Although I will say, I personally feel you start to get kind of diminishing returns in EVFs after you get past the 3 or 4 megapixel range. The back screen is a 3.2 inch, 2.1 megapixel vari-angle LCD. This is the flip out twisty screen that we've seen on a lot of the Canon cameras, and I will continue to say this version of a screen is the most versatile. Even if you have preferences towards some other type of screen, this is the screen that can get you the most angles to shoot from, and therefore is just the most versatile. We also don't have a mode dial in the R5. It's the same as in the R, and when I first started shooting with the R, I didn't think I was going to like this, but I actually way prefer this method now because you don't have to tilt the camera down and look at what mode you're selecting with the dial. You can see what mode you're in and what you're changing all in your EVF or on your back screen, and it goes a lot quicker in my opinion. It's definitely going to be a preference thing, but my preference is for the way that the R and the R5 do it. We also have a lot of controls on these cameras that make it really nice to use and shoot with. We have 3 dials and then an additional dial if you're using an RF lens with the control ring on it. We also have a dedicated joystick that we can use to move around the autofocus points. It does have the touch and drag screen that you can use to move your autofocus points even if you're using the EVF, which is what the R does. And I think that works really well, but I will say that now that I've been using the R5 and the R6 and having that joystick available, I do actually prefer to have the joystick. As far as ports go, we do have a USB-C port that we can use for charging, but we don't get a USB-C charger included with this camera. Then we also have your typical mic, headphone jack. We have a micro HDMI port, which a lot of people aren't necessarily going to be so happy about. We also have the old school flash trigger port that we don't get with the R6, and you don't get it with the R unless you get the extra battery grip. And of course, we have the RF mount on this camera, which again, I will say is very versatile. I have really enjoyed shooting with RF lenses and then also being able to adapt EF and a lot of other lenses onto this mount. So when it comes to photography, I had actually just finished using and testing the R6 when I got this R5 to use, and I was really blown away with the R6 and the image quality from that, and I wasn't expecting the image quality to be that much better than the R6 outside of resolution, but it was. The color depth and the dynamic range at normal ISO values from this camera are just mind-blowing, and even a huge step up, even in dynamic range from the R6, which is saying a lot. The performance as far as handling goes is, I still think, top of class here. The dual pixel autofocus version 2 is just so great, and if you have people in your frame, you're really not going to miss focus. Even with mask, it catches the eye and locks on and sticks. And even when you're shooting at the high bursts of 12 frames per second mechanical or 20 with the electronic shutter, I was shooting my subject walking towards me, walking away, at the side, and never missed. They were all in focus. And the animal eye autofocus on this is also awesome. It's the best animal eye autofocus that I've used personally. And the only con I would say with that is I really wish that in the Q menu there was a quick option to just select between human eye autofocus and animal eye autofocus. At the moment you have to go into the menu to change that, and that's the only kind of gripe I have with this. And like I said, we have a 45 megapixel sensor here, and 45 megapixels gives you so much detail. If you've never shot with a high megapixel camera before, it gives you so much more room to work with in your images, and that goes beyond just being able to crop in or print big and that kind of thing. And one trade-off though that you have to keep in mind is higher resolution is typically going to be not as good in low light performance. And I will say, for a high megapixel sensor, the R5 does really well. I felt like at 20,000 ISO, 25,000 ISO, the R5 was still confident, but it falls off pretty quickly, and around 32,000 ISO, you start to get a lot of noise, and not just noise, but also a lot of color noise, and that's hard to correct and take out in post. And so I think right around that range is where it's going to become quickly less usable. But again, for a high megapixel camera like this, I think the high ISO performance here is really pretty good. So again, this is a high megapixel sensor, and with higher resolution, you do get that extra creative control in post, but it also comes with the fact that your files are just going to be larger, and they are large on this camera. I did 1 hour and a half long shoot, and the files that I got from that shoot ended up being about 80 gigabytes. And so right off the bat, the first thing is you're probably going to have to invest in some extra storage if you go for the R5. And not only that, depending on what editing computer you're using right now, there's a decent chance that you might need to either upgrade that computer and spend more money in that, or that it's going to run a little bit slower because you have these bigger, more intensive files and lose time in your editing workflow because of that. You're also going to probably need some bigger and faster memory cards, and the R5, one of the memory card slots is the CF Express Type B, which is a really great option for a memory card, especially for storing these larger files and keeping up with the speeds, but they're also more expensive than just SD cards. And I will say there is the compressed RAW option, and that is going to make your file sizes about half from what they would be. But for me, if I'm paying the money for a high resolution camera, I'm definitely going to want to have all of the data that I can get from those files. Another thing about the R5 is the in-body image stabilization, and the IBIS in this camera is insane. It works really well. But for me personally, having in-body image stabilization for stills is really not a big deal, for just because of the way I shoot. I don't shoot telephoto really beyond 85 millimeters very often, if at all. And I'm never hand holding low shutter speeds, so it's just not a big deal breaker for me. But the in-body image stabilization does perform really well. However, there are a few little caveats in certain specific situations. Mainly for me, if you have this camera on a tripod, the shutter going off in between shots or turning the camera on and off in between shots can shift the shutter slightly. So if you're doing any kind of work where you're compositing images in post, that can throw that off, and it's something to keep in mind if you're trying to use the R5 for something like that. But overall, I think it's really hard to find a better performing full frame camera with all of these features and this performance without coming close to doubling the price tag. So in video, this camera has some pretty mind-blowing specs, at least on paper, but it's gotten a lot of trash talk online, and mainly because of overheating. So I'm actually going to talk about that first, because I shot with this camera mostly indoors, so we're talking maybe 70 Fahrenheit, 21 degrees Celsius temperatures for the most part, and as much as I shot, I only ever even got one overheating warning, and that was when I was trying to make it overheat in 8K. And I'll also say that it typically tends to show less time that it's available to shoot than it's actually able to shoot, at least on the newest firmware that I was using. And when I was shooting 4K 60 clips in like 1 to 2, maybe 3 minute bursts at a time, I would always forget to turn the camera off in between clips, which is what you're supposed to do to allow it to recover faster. And sometimes the time left would dip down to 25 or 20 minutes of recording left. But again, it tended to be able to do more than that. And again, I never even got an overheating warning in that mode, even when I was filming a lot of clips on and off in 4K 60 for maybe even close to an hour at a time. So again, I did test and try to get the camera to overheat in 8K, and I was shooting in 8K in C-Log because I didn't have the even storage options to try to store that much of the 8K raw. And even in C-Log 8K, about every 10 minutes or so, I had to format the memory card and start the recording over because it's just such huge file sizes. But when I was doing that, around the like 37-minute mark, I started to get an overheating warning. And then at just about 49 minutes, it said that I was not able to record 8K anymore, but it didn't shut the camera off, and I was still able to record regular 4K and anything below that as well, so I could still use the camera even when it did get to that overheating. I will also say, if you're going to be shooting long form 8K, you should probably use like a Red Monstro or something and charge for the 8K content that you're creating. So when it comes to the video recording options, and there are a lot on this camera, first of all, the headliner, we have 8K RAW, 12-bit, internally up to 30 frames. And anything below 8K is not going to have an option for RAW, well, because that's how RAW is. But we do have C-Log 10-bit 422 options in everything if you're shooting in C-Log, and if you're not shooting in C-Log, it's going to be 8-bit 420. And with the non-RAW options, we can choose All-I or IPB, and 8K, we can do that as well in C-Log. We can also do 4K HQ, which is a downsampled mode. So basically you're getting all of the information recorded at 8K and then output into a 4K file. And we can do that at up to 30 frames per second. We can also record 4K up to 120 frames per second, but we can't use the high quality downsampled mode in 4K at anything above 30 frames per second. And this non-downsampled 4K mode, yeah, it is not as detailed as the downsampled 8K, 4K HQ mode, obviously. However, I will say, first of all, most of the time, most of us that are shooting 4K are shooting it to then downsample and output at 1080 anyway, and it's going to have plenty of detail for that. It also has plenty of detail if you want to crop into a 1080 crop in post, and I didn't have any problems with the image quality in 4K at all, if I'm being honest. And another thing to keep in mind is with that regular 4K mode, up to 4K 30, there is no overheating with this camera. So even recording recording long form content with the R5 in 4K, as long as you're in the normal 4K mode, is not going to be an issue at all. The one issue you have to keep in mind is that there is still a 30-minute record limit, so if you're recording for more than 30 minutes at a time, you're gonna have to stop and start the camera at that 30-minute mark. At the moment, the R5 and the R6 only can record in C-Log1, which does not give you the full amount of dynamic range that these cameras would be able to record, and it's possible that it's released by the time you're seeing this video. There's supposed to be a firmware update that will add C-Log3 to both of those cameras. And for the R5 specifically, it's also supposed to add 120 frames per second in 1080, which would give us then also the ability to record 120 frames per second, potentially without any overheating limits as well. So how does this footage look? Well, awesome. The 10-bit colors in this camera are great, and if you're not sure what 10-bit versus 8-bit colors are, it basically just allows for more accurate colors and gives you a lot more room to color grade creatively in post as well. As far as dynamic range in video, it's fine. Right now though, it is artificially limited by the fact that it only has C-Log. Once C-Log3 is added, that's going to give us some more dynamic range, but we're not even planned to get C-Log2, which would give the maximum amount of dynamic range as far as Canon log formats go. However, with the R5, you can get around that by filming in 8K RAW and then interpreting that into C-Log2 when you bring it into post, but of course you're limited to 30 frames per second max, and there's no real way to monitor C-Log2 in the camera right now. So while on the subject of shooting 8K, I want to talk about the 8K files because these things are massive and they're also terrible to work with in post. Even when you're using proxy workflows, it's still even slow, at least slower than using smaller files because the files are so big. And these file formats on the R5 are not the best to use already. And for me, when I was exporting a 10-second 8K clip, and it wasn't even 8K RAW, a export that would have normally taken 2 minutes just because of this 10-second clip at the end ended up taking about 10 minutes to export in Premiere Pro. And when it got to the 8K clip, you could tell really easily that it had gotten there because the progress bar just stopped. And it did export it, but it took a long time. And I will say the 8K looks great, and it's a nice trick to have for certain shots, but most people are not going to need it, and certainly not going to need it on a regular basis. Although I will say, if you are trying to shoot some kind of 8K project, with these newest updates, as long as you're aware of the overheating limits and how to get around that or how to work with that, I think it's plausible to do some kind of 8K projects in this camera. But again, if you're doing an 8K project, especially if you're doing that for a client, get a Red or something and charge them for the 8K project that you're doing. Okay, so now moving on to slow motion. And like I said, there is no option for downsampling 8K to 4K in any of the higher frame rate modes in the R5, but I still think the slow motion looks really good coming out of the R5. I didn't have any complaints with it. It's still really detailed and still plenty of detail even if you're cropping in and changing stuff around in post. One thing to be aware of is that in the 120 frames per second, the camera does output it at 30 frames per second automatically. You can't change that, and it doesn't record audio. And I've seen a little bit of confusion with that online. If you're working in a 24 frame per second timeline, all you have to do is take that 30 frame per second clip and slow it down 80%, and then you have 24 frames per second. And if the camera was outputting 120 frame per second file, you would have to slow that down anyway, so it doesn't really change the workflow at all. It just changes the numbers that you have to put in. All right, so on to the IBIS. The in-body image stabilization in this camera for video is amazing. If you're a handheld shooter, this is just going to be an invaluable asset. People have pointed out that there is the IBIS wobble sometimes, and that is there, but really only when you're shooting ultra wide. We're talking 20 millimeters and beyond. Even at 24 millimeters, I didn't see any of it when I was shooting. And outside of that, so when you're not shooting at ultra wide, the IBIS is really great, and I've really enjoyed the IBIS in the R5 and the R6, and it just makes really usable handheld footage. So now when it comes to low light performance, again, high resolution is typically never going to give you the best low light performance. However, I will say in low light, this camera does do pretty competently. And at 10,000 ISO, we're still looking great. Once we get into the 20,000 and 25,600 range, it still looks pretty usable. At 25,000 range, we are starting to use a little bit of color depth, but I think that's pretty expected for something at this point. And overall, I do think, again, it's a very confident low light shooting camera. And typically, if you can, I would try to avoid those higher ISOs anyway. So when it comes to the H.265 files that you're getting from this camera, if you're shooting in C-Log, they are really rough to work with in post. And you just need to get it through your head that if you're going to do video in C-Log, at least with this camera, you're going to be transcoding or doing some kind of proxy workflow. Even on higher end computers, trying to edit this footage straight in H.265 is really not going to be possible. And especially at the higher resolutions like 8K with the H.265, it's going to slow down the workflow a lot. If you film not in C-Log, so just in the standard baked in profiles that the camera has, it is going to be 8-bit 420 H.264 files, and those are going to be a lot easier to use. And you could use that if you needed a quick turnaround workflow, but I think if you're buying this camera and then shooting and not using the C-Log and other features to get the H.265 files from this camera, it's really a waste unless you're just a photographer and want to shoot a quick behind the scenes shoot, or maybe something for YouTube or something that you're not really needing professional quality from. Then it is going to be something that you can use and have a quicker turnaround workflow. But if you are shooting C-Log, this camera is not going to be for a quick workflow. And then as far as autofocus goes, the dual pixel autofocus version 2 is amazing. Eye tracking is awesome. Even when people are wearing masks, it caught on for me immediately and never lost it. And I felt completely confident using the autofocus in video with the R5. And there's also some cool features that the R5 adds for video, like zebras, and we have 2 levels of zebras that we can set in the camera at once. They're not super customizable, but it is really nice to have a feature like that for video in a Canon camera finally. And overall, I think the R5 is a really great video camera. The overheating, a lot of stuff has been said about it online, but I really don't think it's going to be an issue for most shooters in most situations. You do need to be aware of the overheating and when it will be an issue, but I think for most people, it's really not going to affect your shooting that much. Again, be aware of what you shoot as far as overheating is concerned, but even for long form content in 4K, 30 frames per second and below, you're gonna be fine as long as you're not trying to use the downsampled mode. If for whatever reason you shoot long form content in 4K 60, then you do need to be aware of the overheating issues, obviously in 8K as well. Also be aware, do you need a quick turnaround workflow? Because this is not gonna be the camera for you. And probably my biggest con with this camera and with the R6 as well is that with those H.265 files, it would have been really nice and made the workflow a lot faster and smoother if we could have recorded proxies to the second card in these cameras. And they didn't include that feature. And for me, I think that makes these cameras much less professionally viable in a lot of situations, especially if you're trying to make the workflow just go that little bit faster. But as far as video quality goes, the video from the R5 really is amazing. I was really happy with the video features, but I will also say, if you're looking at the R5 specifically for videos, we have started to hear rumors that there is going to be kind of a cinema camera version of the R5 coming out soon, so that might be something to watch out for as well. So who is this camera for? And I will say, this is just an awesome camera all around. but it also comes with a pretty high price tag. And I do think that what you get is worth the price if you need what you get from this camera. So for instance, if you're a photographer and you're getting paid to shoot high resolution photos, and especially if you're getting paid to shoot high resolution action photos where you need to track movement really quickly, the performance that you get out of this is really great, and honestly pretty close to what you would get out of something like the Sony A1, but at almost half the price of that. For videographers, if you need 4K 120, or if you need 4K long form content and you're okay with it not being in that downsampled 8K mode, of course, you then have to remember that there is a 30-minute time limit, so you will have to be starting and stopping videos that run over 30 minutes, but with that non-HQ mode, you can film for long periods of time and not have to worry about overheating. Also, if you're a videographer who needs some 8K raw content sometimes, which does anybody really need that? And if you do need that, again, I would really suggest look at a cinema camera, because you should probably be charging cinema camera prices if you're creating content for clients that is at 8K. And while we're talking about cinema cameras, there is also, again, that rumor that there's going to be a more cinema camera version of the R5 released sometime this year. And that might be something to look at or look out for if you're thinking you're only going to shoot video from this camera. And who I think this camera is definitely not for is anybody, videographer or photographer, who needs any kind of quick turnaround workflow. The file sizes are just large and they take a lot of processing, both in photo processing and video editing, and probably proxies again in video editing. So it's not something that you're really going to be able to churn out content with very quickly, at least not without a little bit of headache in doing so. You also need to think about the full price of the system. So larger files means more storage. You're also going to need to invest in larger and faster memory cards. Again, the R5 has the CF Express Type B cards, which aren't the most expensive memory cards out there, but they are more expensive than SD cards if you're coming from a camera that only uses SD cards, for instance. And there's also the potential that you're going to need to upgrade your editing computer, whether that is for photo editing or video editing, because of the intensity of processing those files. And if you're not going to upgrade, there's a good chance that it's going to slow down your work file while you're exporting or rendering those files. And for me, the cost of the peripherals of this system is the only reason why I'm not considering getting the R5, even though I was really blown away by the camera and what it can do, especially with the photos coming out of this camera, because they were so beautiful and so fun and awesome to work with. But anyway, I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, give it a thumbs up. If you are thinking about this camera, let me know in the comments below. What do you think about the camera? What are you thinking to use it for? What kind of stuff do you typically shoot, and would you use it on those types of shoots? If you're interested in buying this camera or any of the gear that I've mentioned in this video, in the description below, I'll leave affiliate links. If you purchase through those links at no extra price to you, you'll help to support this channel so that I can continue making videos for you guys. If you haven't yet, hit the subscribe button. See ya.